네, 안녕하세요. 오늘의 신학공부의 장민혁입니다. 오늘은 저희가 정말 특별한 손님을 모시고 저희 IJM이라는 단체와 함께 콜라보로 콘텐츠를 진행하게 되었습니다. IJM은 인터내셔널 저스티스 미션이라는 단체인데요. 빈곤한 사람들을 폭력으로부터 구호하는 활동을 하고 있는 국제 NGO 단체입니다. 그래서 이 IJM의 설립자가 바로 게리 하우겐 대표님이신데 오늘의 신학공부에 출연해 주셨습니다. 감사합니다.
감사합니다.
네, 그래서 먼저 간단하게 한국 시청자분들을 위해서 본인 소개와 인사를 해주시면 좋을 것 같습니다.
Yes, my name is Gary Haugen, and I'm the founder and CEO of International Justice Mission, which was started in 1997. And it began as a way to provide Christians with a way to recover the biblical teaching about justice and to recover the biblical ministry of justice.
이제 대부분 다 구독자분들이 저한테 주신 질문인데요. 세상에는 다양한 이유로 어렵게 사는 사람들이 많은데 그 중에 특별히 노예처럼 착취받는 분들에게 관심을 가지게 된 계기가 있으셨나요?
Yeah, I actually grew up in a place of great affluence where I was not exposed to very much poverty or suffering. But as I read the Bible and understood Jesus more, I understood the way he drew close to those who were suffering and vulnerable. The world is full of people suffering from poverty, abuse, and God spends all of his days with them. So I felt like there was something I would just never know or understand about God if I did not share his experience of being intimate with those who are suffering and poor in our world. But over time, as I spent more time with people who were in poverty in the world, I noticed that there was a form of suffering that they were enduring that no one was talking about. People were talking about the way they suffer because they don't have access to the gospel or don't have access to food or medicine or shelter. But what I saw is that they were also suffering because of violence and abuse. I saw this most dramatically when I was the director of the UN genocide investigation in Rwanda. And it seemed like the church community had a way to respond to every other need. They had a way to respond to the need for church planting and for addressing hunger and poverty and disease, but they didn't seem to have a way to respond to the problem of violence and abuse. And yet the Bible is full of violence and injustice and abuse and full of teaching from God about how he feels about it and how he calls his people to respond to it. So it seemed if God was passionate about the poor and about injustice, that God's people should be passionate about the poor and about injustice. And so I began this journey of trying to explore answers.
제가 듣다가 궁금한 점이 생겼는데요. 그러니까 이런 빈곤이나 폭력의 문제에 대해서 뭔가 해결해야 된다고 말하는 단체들을 여러 본 것 같은데 혹시 IJM은 그것과 다른 어떤 구체적인 조치들이 있나요?
My experience is there's lots of people who can come up with ways to get out of poverty. But I encountered that they didn't have answers for the problem of violence and slavery. And so we began very simply by taking on individual cases of people who had been trafficked into slavery and spent the first 10 years taking on individual cases of men, women, and children who had been trafficked into slavery or were suffering other forms of violence. And we would try to rescue them out of that abuse, make sure that the criminals were brought to justice, and make sure that the survivors had restoration and healing. So this was the distinctive element of IJM. We wouldn't just bring awareness to the problems or speak to governments that they should do something about it. We would take on specific cases ourselves to work with the government to make sure that the individuals were actually provided with rescue and restoration. And after we did that for 10 years, tens of thousands of individual cases, we began to see if we could actually leverage all that we were learning to transform those justice systems with the authorities so they would protect the poor from those abuses happening in the first place. These are justice system strengthening projects. So what was distinctive about IJM is that we would bring direct service to the individual, but also work for measurable transformation of the justice system in that community. And the third thing that was distinctive was that we held ourselves accountable to have outside experts actually measure whether or not our program was actually reducing the amount of slavery and violence. And so in every case now, slavery and violence in these communities has been reduced by between 50 and 85% as measured by outside evaluators. So deliver service for the individual, transform the system, and hold yourself accountable to measurable results. I think those are the distinctive elements of IJM.
그럼 IJM의 이런 활동 특성상 특정 나라의 실정법과 이런 사역이 충돌하는 경우도 있을 것 같은데요. 이런 상황에서 어떻게 우선순위를 정하시는지 그리고 어떻게 대처하시는지 궁금합니다.
Yes, that's a great question. The first thing is that we are always working for the enforcement of the country's own laws. So we're not bringing some foreign standard of justice or legal standard. Slavery, sexual violence, police abuse, domestic violence, all these are already against the law in all the communities where we work. The problem is the law is not enforced for the poorest and most vulnerable. The second critical factor is all the IJM teams are local nationals working in their own country. So it's Cambodians in Cambodia and Kenyans in Kenya and Bolivians in Bolivia. So they are fighting for the enforcement of their own law for their most vulnerable citizens. And so global IJM is just supporting those local champions as they fight for justice in their own communities.
그러면 이제 불의를 없애기 위한 활동이 다른 정의와 부딪힐 때 어떻게 하시는지 궁금합니다. 그러니까 현실에서 일어나는 일들은 되게 복잡하게 얽혀 있어서 단순히 정의 대 불의로 규정하기 어려울 때가 많은데요. 사람들이 불의에 맞서지 않는 게 용기가 없어서가 아니라 복잡한 세상에서 내가 믿는 정의만으로는 부딪혀서 안 된다는 것을 알기 때문은 아닐까 싶은 생각도 듭니다. 그래서 이에 대한 대표님의 의견이 궁금합니다.
Yes, this is a common misunderstanding that paralyzes a lot of people from actually doing the work of justice. Most of the injustice that afflicts the poor is not complicated. In a back room of a brothel in Cambodia, I found a dozen children between the age of 5 and 10 years of age who were being sold to foreign pedophiles and sex tourists. It's not a complicated question as to whether that's okay or not. It's not okay to sell children into forced prostitution. It's already against the law. Millions of people in slavery in rock quarries or rice mills or fishing boats. Their enslavement is already against the law. There are lots of very complicated questions of injustice in the world. Very complicated questions in my country and in Korea and everybody's country. But we are focused on the uncomplicated ones. Just because they're simple doesn't mean they aren't very difficult, because there are determined people of violence who will hurt you if you try to stop this abuse. They make a lot of money off of this abuse. They acquire power from the abuse. We've had IJM staff kidnapped, assaulted, and murdered. That's why this work is difficult and requires courage. We shouldn't imagine it's because it's complicated. For sure, the Nazis were not complicated. But it was still difficult and scary to confront them. And that is the great calling of this era, is for courage.
그럼 이제 한국교회와 관련된 질문인데요. 한국교회 일각에서는 인권을 중시하는 태도가 기독교 신앙과 충돌한다고 여기는 경우가 있는 것 같습니다. 그래서 인권에 대한 강조에 이제 인간 중심주의가 토대를 두고 있고 무신론적 사상과 이게 연결된다고 보는 입장들이 있는 것 같은데요. 이로 인해서 제가 알기로는 그 IJM 코리아도 인권 정의라는 단어를 직접적으로 사용하는데 좀 고민이 많다고 들었습니다. 그래서 이런 인권 정의가 기독교 복음과 어떻게 연결되는지 대표님의 의견이 궁금합니다.
Yes, this was a concern of a lot of Christian leaders when IJM got started, because there was a concern that justice sounds like a political program. And it's true that lots of words from the Bible and from the teachings of Jesus have been used by political programs. I grew up in an era in which the communists were using words like justice and liberation and revolution and ending oppression. And so Christians were afraid to use those words. But those are ancient biblical words. Just because the pop singers are singing about love differently than we as Christians speak of love doesn't mean we should stop thinking about and studying love. Global human rights actually emerged from the Christian teachings about the dignity and value of every life. The British historian Tom Holland's written a marvelous book recently called Dominion, which traces the story of how the Christian religion gave birth to modern human rights in the Western world. So it's understandable that people are confused that if we talk about justice and human rights, it's going to be captured by a political agenda. But it's not a reason to abandon the clear teaching of the Bible about justice. As Thomas Aquinas taught, the biblical teaching of justice is simply rooted in the law of love. Jesus taught us to do for others what we would want done for us. So if we were enslaved, so what would we want others to do for us? We'd want them to speak up for us. We'd want them to seek justice for us. And that's why it's a clear command from Scripture. Isaiah 1:17 says, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. Many have been so afraid that these biblical concepts will be confused with a political program that they've just neglected actually reading the scriptures that teach about justice. I was telling some pastors that a friend of mine works for the Apple computer company, and on his business card it says he's a software evangelist. So a company has decided to use a powerful word of evangelism, but that's not a reason for us to abandon the word evangelism. The psalmist says that justice is the foundation of God's throne. So it seems that we cannot let go of the foundation of God's throne.
이제 책에 대한 질문을 조금 하고 싶은데요. 정의를 위한 용기에 보면 백악관을 그만두고 기관을 설립한 후 집 차고에서 얼마 동안 기도하셨다는 이야기가 나오는데 그때 어떤 기도를 하셨는지 궁금합니다.
The prayer was for God to raise up a generation of Christians who would be a voice for those who were being abused and enslaved in our world. I was praying for the body of Christ to recover a sense of hope that God could use them for his work of compassion and justice in the world, because I sensed that Christians had lost hope in that. And so I was also praying and asking if God could use me to help encourage that recovery of the biblical witness for justice in the world.
또 책과 관련된 질문인데요. 정의를 위한 용기 1장에서 산을 오르는 모험을 선택할지 관광 안내소에 머무르기를 선택할지 설명하신 부분이 되게 인상적이었습니다. 그래서 그 대목을 읽으면서 제 삶은 어디에 안주하고 있을까를 돌아보게 되었는데요. 근데 한편으로는 모두가 산을 오르는 모험을 선택할 수는 없지 않을까 싶은 생각도 들었습니다. 그러니까 누군가는 그 관광 안내소를 잘 가꾸는 성직이로 부름받을 수도 있는 게 아닐까 싶었는데요. 그러니까 개인의 성향과 상황에 따라 다른 선택지가 있는 것인지 아니면 모두가 불의와 직접 맞서 싸우는 삶으로 부름받은 것인지 그에 대한 의견이 궁금합니다.
Thank you for the wonderful question. I think many times people can feel like we are encouraging them just to do one thing, but we all have different kinds of mountains and different kinds of courage is required. And so we have different callings of loving and caring for those who are in need. Loving people in need in a fallen world will always require courage, no matter what kind of need it is. The courage of caring for a sick child, the courage for caring for an aging adult, the courage for speaking the truth at work, the courage to serve in quiet and silent ways. These all require courage. But what I would invite is for those who engage your channel and are listening to this conversation is to open themselves up to hear about those who are suffering under violence and slavery in the world and see if God provokes them to some step of action, some step to learn more, to raise their voice, to partner with IJM or another ministry. But that will be the prompting of God. And the whole thing I invite is they open themselves up to whatever that invitation from God might be.
이제 용기가 필요하다는 것에 대해서는 많은 분들이 공감하실 것 같은데 그 용기를 우리가 어떻게 낼 수 있을까 그걸 좀 도와주실 수 있는 구체적인 방법이 있으면 알려주시면 좋을 것 같습니다.
We're actually studying the spiritual grace of courage all year at IJM, and we've come up with a working definition from the scriptures. We define Christian courage this way. Courage is a divine superpower to take on and persevere in hard things so you can do what you most want to do and be who you most want to be in a fallen world. It's counterintuitive because it begins with desire. What most do you want to do? God has given you a desire to do good and create beauty. This YouTube conversation is doing good and creating beauty. And that's a beautiful desire. But in a fallen world, it's going to be hard to do. And so it has required courage for you to take this on and to persevere, and courage to be who you most want to be, because you want to be humble, but honest and authentic and thoughtful in all of your dealings and conversations. But in a fallen world, it will take courage to try to be that, because there'll be temptations to be other things. So I'm sorry if my answer is too abstract, but that's why it's different for every child of God. What are their highest desires that God has placed in their heart? And then what is the courage that we need from God to actually pursue those things? I think it takes courage to look at the problem of child sexual abuse in the world. It takes courage to open one's heart to the suffering of people in slavery in the world. It takes courage to raise your voice when no one really wants to listen to you. It takes courage to share your resources so someone can go and rescue the person in slavery. It takes courage to leave your occupation maybe and make it your task to take on the witness for God's love in a world of slavery. So these are the ways in which, if Christians are going to take on the struggle for slavery, it is going to require courage.
이제 거의 마지막 부분인데요. 게리 대표님에 대한 개인적인 질문들을 좀 드리고 싶습니다. 그래서 게리 대표님은 인생의 중요한 선택을 할 때 어떤 기준을 세우고 결정하시는지, 또 20, 30대의 게리 대표님과 지금의 게리 대표님의 고민은 어떻게 다른지 궁금합니다.
Those are very big questions. I think for making decisions, one of the standards that I try to think about is, am I making a decision out of fear? I don't want to make decisions out of fear. This requires a constant inner reflection and conversation with God about what are the insecurities, what are the anxieties that might be driving my decisions. More than any other command, Jesus said to his disciples, don't be afraid. And so I always want to inventory what is the fear that might be driving a decision. That's the answer to your first question. I think in my 20s and 30s, I was worried that my life wouldn't matter. I grew up in a family culture that valued education very highly. And I know Koreans likewise value education. So you get this education as a young person and you work very hard to obtain it. And I had the privilege of going to Harvard University for my university education, which was a very prominent education, which sounds wonderful until you realize, well, is the best thing I ever will do with my life something I finished when I was in my 20s? Is it all just downhill from here? So I had those typical anxieties of a 20-year-old of, well, will I turn out to be a disappointment, or will I somehow have a life that doesn't matter? And what I sensed from God was for me to consider the life that matters to Him. And that if you're willing to go and serve those who are in need, your life is always going to matter. It will matter to the one who is in need, and it will matter to God. It may not matter to the world, it may not matter on any scale of prestige, but if the real value of life is what matters to those in need and what matters to God, then I have the perfect equation for living a life that matters. So I found freedom from worrying about whether or not my life will matter to others. And I could just find joy in serving those who are in need and finding a life that mattered. And then God gave me this whole community at IJM, those who similarly are just seeking to have their lives matter to God and matter to those in need. I've been surprised by the joy of this gift.
한국인 분이신데 국제 구호단체에서 근무하고 계신 분이 주신 질문인데요. 오랜 기간 구호단체를 이끌어 오실 수 있었던 가장 큰 동력과 매일 좌절하지 않고 버텨낼 수 있는 동력은 무엇인지 궁금합니다.
That is the hard part, to do the work of serving those in need for a long time. But after 25 years, I find I have more energy for that than ever. Lots of things have been important in that journey. The first is our rhythm of prayer at IJM. Every day of work, we first take a half hour to do no work, but to sit in silence, in solitude, spiritually preparing for the day of work. That has rescued us from the pressure of thinking that the world is going to be saved by our work. So I don't have to bear the weight of all of that. We throw off that weight every day, twice a day, throw it off and allow God to carry that weight. The second thing that we also do is we chase joy. We say joy is the oxygen for doing hard things. We do very hard things, but then we come up for air to be refreshed with joy. So that's laughter and love and good food and recreation and just the silliness of life. God doesn't call us to wallow in the darkness of suffering all of the time. The Bible says the joy of the Lord is our strength. So we chase joy as a discipline. When I got on the airplane to come here to Korea, the flight attendant said that we should put on our own oxygen mask first before assisting others. If you're going to serve the poor and the hurting in the world and do it for a long time, you need to secure your own oxygen mask of joy first before serving others. Those who are suffering in the world don't need our spasms of passion. They need our long obedience in the same direction, sustained by joy and a loving community of prayer. So I think that is what's helped us do this for 25 years now.
네, 오늘 이렇게 긴 시간 같이 인터뷰해 주셔서 감사드리고요. 마지막으로 이제 한국의 그리스도인들에게 한 말씀 부탁드립니다.
I'm so excited to be here in Korea with the brand new IJM team in Korea. Everyone knows that the story of the Korean church is one of the great miraculous stories in the history of the Christian church. But I think there is a new chapter emerging for a younger generation of Koreans who will be taking the truth of the gospel and seeing it actually serve in the most difficult, heartbreaking parts of our world in this era. I think there's a new generation of Korean Christians who feel God's passion for justice in their heart. But if they don't see God's passion for justice manifest in His church and in His people, they'll be tempted to drift away. Or they will recover the ministry of justice and recover the spiritual vitality of the Korean church. I think God is doing a new thing in this generation of Korean Christians, and I'm praying that IJM will be a good servant to that new generation of Christians who share God's passion for justice.
네, 오늘은 게리 하우겐 대표님과 이야기를 나눠봤습니다. 저희가 이런 고통의 문제나 악의 문제에 대해서 어떤 태도를 가지고 살아야 할지 다 같이 고민해보고 또 우리가 당장 행동할 것들이 있다면 행동하면 좋겠습니다. 네, 오늘 이렇게 출연해주셔서 감사드리고요. 저희는 또 다음에 좋은 컨텐츠로 돌아오도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다. 감사합니다.
감사합니다.